of the 1920s. Let's start with the Warren G. Harding administration. He was elected president November of 1920, inaugurated March of 21. He got elected on this idea of return to normalcy. Uh, it tapped into people's desire to go back to the way that things were before World War I. Unfortunately, that wasn't really going to be possible. His administration, many of his cabinet appointments were known as the Ohio Gang. That's because many of them were personal friends of his, and they were disastrous appointments. Many of his cabinet appointments used their influential jobs for their own gain. For example, the director of Veterans Bureau, Charles Forbes, sold scarce medical supplies taken from veterans' hospitals. Remember, this is right after World War I, in which many veterans came home when needed medical care. He sold the supplies to private organizations and kept the money for himself. The Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, illegally allowed private companies to drill for oil in areas reserved for the U.S. Navy, and that would be, this area was known as Teapot Dome. In return, Albert Fall received bribes for over $300,000. Now, the U.S. Navy had oil wells set aside for reserve in a time of war that we could tap into that and have supplies to power our ships, for example, to protect the country. But Albert Fall decided he wanted to sell those rights and make money off it. Attorney General Harry Doherty accepted bribes from German agents seeking to buy a German-owned company that was taken by the U.S. government during World War I. Now, when many of these scandals were breaking, remember he had been only started being president in March of 21, so in about 2.5 years later, he dies of a heart attack, and his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, pictured here, becomes the new president. And during the 20s overall, which covered mostly the presidency of Calvin Coolidge, who served from August of 23 through January of 1929, the goals for the economy were to balance the budget and reduce the government's debt and to cut taxes. You have to go back to World War I, why this was such a big deal. The government borrowed lots of money to wage the war. They raised taxes, and so these were seen as being problematic and a desire for the country to go back to the way it was before World War I. There is also this issue of supply-side economics. That's an economic theory that lower taxes, especially for wealthier people, will boost the economy as businesses invest their money, thereby expanding the economy for the benefit of all. I help the people at the top, and eventually they'll create more jobs, and the economy will grow, and the people at the bottom will benefit too. Coolidge also focused on this idea, and actually Hoover, who was president after him, focused on this idea of cooperative individualism. That's a policy of encouraging manufacturers and distributors to form their own organizations and volunteer information to the federal government, an effort to stimulate the economy. As you can imagine, this wasn't terribly successful because most corporations were interested only in themselves and getting richer and more powerful. During the 1920s, the biggest foreign policy issues were isolationism, the Dawes Plan, Washington Conference, and the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Isolationism was a national policy of avoiding involvement in world affairs. This was the response to having been involved in World War I. It's really important that you understand how traumatic World War I was for the nation and for the world. The slaughter that took place was beyond anything that had previously been seen, and Americans who didn't really want to be involved in the war anyway were really traumatized by that whole experience. The Dawes Plan was to deal with this issue of reparation payments. American banks would make loans to Germany so it could make reparation payments to France and Britain, so France and Britain could repay the war debts to the United States. So France and Britain borrowed money from the United States they couldn't pay back. They put reparations or fined Germany because Germany lost the war, so they got blamed for it and had to pay for it. But Germany had no money. So this graphic on this slide really pictures what was taking place here. U.S. banks would loan money to Germany, who would pay it to the Allies, who would pay it back to us. In the Washington Conference, out of that came the five-power naval limitation treaty between Britain, France, Italy, Japan, and U.S. And the biggest thing about this, and the purpose of this, was to start to de-escalate the military and get rid of a lot of the ships and things that were built and people wanting to go away from war. But the biggest thing this did was it caused anger on the part of Japan. They were really angry that they had to accept smaller navies in Great Britain and U.S. and really put us on a collision course with Japan. And the Kellogg-Briand Pact was when nations agreed to abandon war and to settle all disputes by peaceful means, basically made war illegal. Like a lot of laws, this carried the force of law. Like a lot of laws, it was ignored. And that gives you a little glimpse into the politics of the 1920s.